This is Noise from the Cranium. My name is Doug, and in this episode I'll conclude my look at the Canterbury Scene. One band that doesn't get a lot of attention in discussions of the Canterbury Scene is Delivery. Mainly a blues band, Delivery was formed in 1966 by Phil Miller and his brother Steve. When blues artists like B.B. King, Lowell Fulson, and Otis Spann toured the UK, Delivery would serve as the backup band. They also played regularly upstairs at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club. Having loftier aspirations than being a backup band, they released their first album, Fool's Meeting, in 1970, at which time the band included the Miller Brothers as well as Roy Babington, Carol Grimes, Lol Coxell, and Pip Pyle. They started moving away from their blues-based sound, adding some covers by jazzers such as Keith Jarrett and Tony Williams before breaking up the following year, with Pyle leaving to join Gong, Babington joining Nucleus and eventually Soft Machine, Steve Miller ending up in Caravan, while brother Phil joined Matching Mole. In 1972, after Phil Miller's stint in Matching Mole, he returned to Delivery, where they soon changed their name to Hatfield in the North. The idea for the name came from a sign posted on the northbound side of the M1 motorway, advising that the motorway led to the town of Hatfield and other destinations to the north. By the time of their self-titled debut, the band had gone through a few keyboard players, including David Sinclair, who left to rejoin Caravan, and Alan Gowan, who opted to stay with his own band Gilgamesh, a fellow Canterbury Scene band that included Phil Lee and Neil Murray. The keyboard slot was finally filled by Dave Stewart from Egg, who completed the lineup along with Miller, Richard Sinclair from Caravan, and a returning Pip Pyle. They were a prog supergroup and recorded 2 albums between 1974 and 1975, with their first considered to be one of the best Canterbury albums of all time. Both albums are filled with a combination of complex jazzy instrumentals and typical Canterbury-styled lyrics, not to mention song titles such as Going Up to People and Tinkling, the Monty Python-inspired Your Majesty is Like a Cream Donut, and this song, Gigantic Land Crabs in Earth Takeover Bid. In 1973, Hatfield in the North and Gilgamesh played a couple of concerts together, each performing a set of their own material. Then, both bands took the stage together as an octet and played songs that had been arranged especially for these shows by Gowan. These events planted the seed for Dave Stewart and Gowan to consider a merger of the two bands. In 1975, after Gilgamesh had released one album of complex jazz fusion, and Hatfield in the North had released their second album, Stewart and Gowan left their respective bands and formed National Health, named after Stewart's brand of eyeglasses. Also in the original lineup were Mont Campbell from Egg, Bill Bruford from Yes and King Crimson, and Phil Lee from Gilgamesh. The idea was to create a rock orchestra. After months of rehearsals, some demos, and a short tour, the inevitable parade of lineup changes began, as Gowan, Lee, Bruford, and Campbell all left. When the dust settled, Phil Miller and Pip Pyle were brought back in from Hatfield in the North to join Stewart and Murray. In an ironic twist of fate, with the exception of Neil Murray, Stewart ended up playing with the same musicians in National Health as when he quit Hatfield the previous year. Meanwhile, Gowan resurrected Gilgamesh for one more album with Hugh Hopper from Soft Machine before disbanding once again. Gowan returned to National Health briefly before sadly passing away from leukemia in 1981. National Health continued to endure more lineup changes as well, as Murray left the Canterbury Scene altogether to play with a string of hard rock and heavy metal bands such as Whitesnake, Black Sabbath, and Gary Moore. He was replaced by John Greaves from Henry Cow. Finally, National Health called it a day in 1981, although they did reform briefly to play a few dates to raise money for Gowan's funeral, and to record one more album as a tribute to Gowan featuring his unreleased compositions. Bill Bruford had been kicking around after Robert Fripp disbanded King Crimson in 1974. He became a drummer for hire and had played with Canterbury bands Gong and National Health. In 1977, after tiring of being a hired gun, he decided to get his own band off the ground, forming Bruford with Dave Stewart, Alan Holdsworth, and American bassist Jeff Berlin. After a brief stint in Prague supergroup UK, Bruford and Holdsworth returned to the Bruford Band, releasing their second album called One of a Kind, a jazz fusion masterwork featuring this track written by Dave Stewart and Alan Gowan called Hell's Bells. The band released 2 more albums before breaking up, as they were in a precarious financial position. The financial escape hatch was for Bill Bruford to go back to a newly reformed King Crimson. Following that, Dave Stewart formed a duo with Barbara Gaskin, while Holdsworth and Berlin went on to have successful solo careers in jazz fusion. Henry Cow and Camel are 2 examples of bands that fall into a gray area between the Canterbury scene and other styles of prog. When Andrew Latimer, Doug Ferguson, Andy Ward, and Pete Bardens first played together as Camel in 1971, their blues and soul roots provided the basis for their sound. However, as they searched for something a bit more distinctive, they experimented with Santana-styled guitar jams and Caravan-influenced odd time signatures, the latter forming part of their association with the Canterbury scene. Their second album, Mirage, displayed the strongest ties to the Canterbury sound, as heard on this song, The White Rider. Wanting to shed the blues stylings altogether and develop a more English or European sound, they experimented with a symphonic style. Having recorded and played shows with an orchestra, they're more often considered to be a symphonic prog band rather than a Canterbury band. However, their Canterbury scene connection was underscored in 1977 when Richard Sinclair, former Caravan and Hatfield in the North member, was brought in on bass and vocals. In fact, on their Breathless tour, Camel became a 6-piece band, with David and Richard Sinclair and Jan Schellhaas all joining from Caravan, causing Latimer to joke about changing the band name to Caramel. Camel carried on into the 90s, with Andrew Latimer relocating to the US and taking the band name with him to release 3 concept albums through that decade. Their final studio album was released in 2002, but Latimer continues to tour sporadically under the Camel banner. Henry Cow have very tenuous ties with the Canterbury scene. Stylistically, their music did originally borrow from the soft machine school of sound, but they also brought in a lot of other influences. Their first album, Legend or Leg End, was the closest they would get to the Canterbury sound. Henry Cow, as with many of the Canterbury bands, had a rather fluid lineup. Key members included Fred Frith, Tim Hodgkinson, John Greaves, and Chris Cutler, all of whom had ties to bands and musicians involved in the Canterbury scene, such as Robert Wyatt, National Health, and Soft Heap. The closest Canterbury connection would be Henry Cow drummer Chris Cutler, who was a former roommate of Steve Hillage and good friend of the band Egg. In fact, Cutler and Egg's Dave Stewart created a musicians collective in 1971 called the Ottawa Music Company, which ran for 2 years and included the other members of Egg, Steve Hillage, and Henry Cow. Cutler ended up joining Henry Cow and soon left the company to pursue their own musical path. They went on to become more avant-garde, joining with the band Slap Happy for a couple of albums and creating challenging, eclectic, complex, atonal music that crossed between free jazz and chaotic and experimental classical music, with lyrics and song titles referencing communist and socialist leanings. The degree of complexity in their music is mind-boggling at times. For example, by using the Fibonacci sequence of numbers, where a string of numbers is derived from adding the previous two integers together, they created a piece in 55/8 time. Were they prog? Were they Canterbury? In the end, Henry Cow was so different that they ended up being categorized in their own prog subgenre, the rock and opposition movement. Either way, although they were far from a commercially viable band, Henry Cow remains a uniquely interesting band that played some of the most original music of the 20th century. While many of the Canterbury bands and musicians are still active today, it is nonetheless encouraging to see that there are a few modern bands carrying on in the Canterbury tradition, like Sid Arthur, Magic Bus, Amoeba Split, and this band from Italy called Homunculus Res. This has been Noise from the Cranium. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.